This next section we will be covering is courts. The country that my group and I believe to have a remarkable court system is China. The following slides will go in depth about the hierarchical structure, the people involved, and what types of training these individuals may need. But before we get started, we want to make it clear that the reason why China is more prevailing over the other countries is because this country thrives on forming their system around a more community-based atmosphere. In other words, the country is willing to share their judicial powers with members of the community to help better assist the court structure as a whole. As you can see, we're moving on to China's court structure, and in the middle is a brief diagram of what their structure looks like. So let's begin with Supreme People's Court. So the Supreme People's Court is in charge of overseeing and advising the tiers below them. They also only handle cases that have a direct effect on the country. And the other two tiers, Higher People's Court and Intermediate People's Court, they house the same personnel as one another, but the only difference between the two is that Higher People's Court is stationed in larger cities of China. For example, one would see Higher People's Court located in Beijing or Shanghai, whereas Intermediate People's Court would be located in more rural areas of China. Now for Basic People's Court, also referred to as BPC, they have a more laid-back vibe to them. They can house the same personnel as 3 tiers above them, but usually they only have 1 to 3 judges, and if the case is serious enough, they'll move their case hearing to Intermediate People's Court. Now for mediation committees, which is also referred to as People Mediation Committees and abbreviated as PMC, they are basically branches located in neighborhood communities to help mediate everyday issues and concerns, such as they'll deal with misdemeanors, traffic violations, civil matters, but nothing as serious as what Basic People's Court would deal with or associate with, and also Intermediate's People Court. Now let's move on to courtroom actors. So Supreme People's Court and Higher People's Court, as I mentioned earlier, have the same personnel. Same as Intermediate People's Court, they all have the same personnel involved. They always require 3 to 7 judges, but it always has to be an odd number. They mix up the amount of judges and people's advisors within their system. And for the Supreme Court and Higher People's Court, they always have a defendant, a procurator, a defender, a victim, a witness, and an interpreter. Whereas Intermediate People's Court, it just depends on the seriousness of the offense. Whereas if a defendant needs to have someone defending them, or there's victims involved, or there's eyewitnesses, this is where these other personnels would step in. On to the courtroom actors within Basic People's Court and the mediation committees. So 1 to 20 elected community members run these two branches, but for the Basic People's Court, they sometimes will have a judge be on their panel just to oversee and advise these community members to make sure they're doing their job correctly. Going back to these elected community members, they must be extremely knowledgeable with crime and policies within their community. They must be active with other members of their society and their neighborhood. And the government, once they are elected, government officials will teach these members how to prosecute, how to mitigate, how to basically handle cases that do not involve violence or harsh penalties against these people. But if a defendant will be served to have 3 years or less in a prison or jail, a judge from the Intermediate People's Court must be present before any actions or penalties are served. Now moving on to judicial training. So China is rather laid back on how they train their personnel. So, for example, PMC and BBC, like I said earlier, they must be elected, be extremely knowledgeable, and have official training from the Chinese government. Whereas the other personnel that I mentioned in the previous slide, such as judges, lawyers, people assessors, defenders, and even interpreters, they must have some kind of law degree, bachelor degree, master's degree, and have some experience working inside a courthouse, courtroom, or handling hearings, case files, etc. Bottom line is with these personnels is that the more experience they have inside a courtroom and working court case files and attending hearings, presenting hearings, making mandatory appeals and representing defendants, the more likely they are to move up the hierarchical ladder. And maybe someday, if they wish, they can be a judge. Overall reason why my group and I chose China is because they do offer this judicial power to community members. And Japan also does this too, but the across the globe do not offer this type of power to the community. And doing this, China is strengthening bonds, providing a more positive attitude about the criminal justice system as a whole, and not just a positive attitude about the court system. So this is the reason why we chose China, is because they are very community based. And now moving on to corrections.